I was standing completely still outside the heavy oak doors of my father's study when I heard the exact words that shattered my entire future. My own father, Julian Pierce, a man who built a massive real estate empire in Atlanta and valued high society status above his own children, was having a private conversation with my fiancé, Marcus. I had just come downstairs, excited to show them the fabric swatches for my wedding dress. Instead, I heard my father's booming voice tell the man I loved that he was making a massive mistake by marrying me. He told Marcus that my best friend Camille came from the right kind of old money, that she was much more sophisticated, and that she was the only suitable match for a rising corporate lawyer who wanted a seat on his board of directors. He actually called me a stubborn embarrassment who lacked the refinement of a true society wife. My blood ran completely cold. I held my breath waiting for Marcus to defend me, to tell my father that he loved me, and that our 5-year relationship meant more than country club memberships and corporate power. But Marcus did not defend me. He simply agreed, laughing softly, saying he and Camille had already discussed the logistics of ending our engagement quietly. I did not scream. I did not burst into the room and demand an explanation. I walked back upstairs, packed 2 suitcases, left my engagement ring on the pristine kitchen counter, and walked out of that toxic house forever. I moved across the world to Barcelona, Spain, taking nothing but my savings and a desperate need to build a life where I was more than just a disappointment to the Pierce family legacy. For 5 years, I completely cut off all contact. I poured my tears and my anger into a technology startup building a global supply chain platform from the very bottom up. I found a new life, a new purpose, and a man who loved me fiercely for exactly who I was. Then the invitation arrived for my father's 75th birthday gala. My younger sister emailed me mocking my startup and offering to let her white Wall Street husband buy my plane ticket because she assumed I was broke and struggling. My family thought I was returning to Atlanta to crawl back and beg for their financial support. They thought I would sit quietly in the corner while Marcus and Camille flaunted their perfect wealthy marriage. They thought they had won, but what they did not know was that their precious real estate empire was currently collapsing under massive debt. They were desperately begging a European investment group for a life-saving buyout. So I put on my best dress and walked into that gala. And when my new husband finally walked through those grand double doors to join me, the arrogant smirks completely vanished from my family's faces. Crystal glasses actually slipped from their hands and shattered on the marble floor. Because the billionaire European investor, they were all waiting to grovel to the man who held their entire financial survival in the palm of his hand, was my husband. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to walk away from a toxic family to discover your true worth, and stay tuned to hear exactly how I brought my father's empire crashing down to the ground. The betrayal that forced me to flee to Spain did not happen overnight. It was the culmination of a lifetime of suffocating expectations and relentless emotional warfare. The true breaking point began exactly 1 month before my wedding during a dinner party that perfectly encapsulated my exact role in the Pierce family. The suffocating scent of expensive floral arrangements and my mother's signature Chanel perfume set the stage for the evening. Our Buckhead estate was buzzing with the chaotic energy of a high society invasion. We were hosting a private fundraising dinner for the city's most influential political and business figures. This was not just a meal. It was a calculated display of power and social dominance. And in my family, maintaining that flawless image of Black excellence was absolutely everything. My mother Vivian was a woman who commanded respect through sheer intimidation. As a former regional president of her elite sorority and a staple in the Atlanta social scene, she operated our home like a military general. She intercepted me in the grand marble foyer before I could even take off my coat. Her eyes did not greet mine with warmth or maternal affection. They immediately darted to the top of my head, narrowing with instant freezing disapproval. I had spent hours carefully styling my natural hair. I wore it in a full, unapologetic twist out that framed my face perfectly. I felt beautiful. I felt powerful. I felt like myself. But my mother looked at me as if I had intentionally tracked mud across her imported Italian rugs. "What exactly is happening on your head, Nia?" Her voice was a sharp, venomous whisper, perfectly calibrated to cut deep without carrying into the adjoining rooms. "We have the mayor's chief of staff arriving in 20 minutes. We have the hospital board of directors. You are not walking into my dining room looking like a political protest." I tried to hold my ground, keeping my voice as calm as possible. "Mom, it is just my natural hair. It is styled. It is professional. This is how it grows out of my head. There is nothing wrong with it." She stepped closer, her perfectly manicured fingers grabbing my wrist with a surprising painful strength. "It is unrefined. It lacks the polish required for a woman of your standing. You are about to marry into the Davenport family. Marcus deserves a wife who understands the art of presentation. Do not embarrass your father tonight. Go upstairs right now and slick that mess back into a tight bun. Better yet, put on the straight weave I bought you for your birthday. The one that actually makes you look elegant." The familiar knot of deep inadequacy formed in my throat. This was the psychological warfare I had endured my entire life. My identity, my very physical being, was always subject to her strict edits. I swallowed the heavy lump of humiliation, marched up the sweeping staircase, and aggressively brushed my curls back. I pulled my hair into a severe, painful bun, securing it with enough pins to give me an instant migraine. I stripped away the version of myself I loved just to make her comfortable. When I finally descended the stairs and slipped into my seat at the long mahogany table, the seating arrangement alone told the entire story of my worth in this family. My father, Julian Pierce, sat at the head of the table. He was a man who radiated the sheer arrogance of someone who owned half the commercial real estate in downtown Atlanta. Directly to his right, in the seat of absolute honor, sat my younger sister Chloe and her husband Spencer. Chloe was the undisputed golden child. She had lighter skin, wore her hair bone straight, and spent her days planning charity luncheons and polishing her flawless image. Spencer was a white investment banker from a wealthy old money family in Connecticut. To my father, Spencer was the ultimate prize. He was a direct connection to Wall Street capital and white corporate America. My father paraded Spencer around like a trophy, validating his own success through his son-in-law's pedigree. I, the eldest daughter, was seated near the far end of the table, much closer to the kitchen swinging doors than to the guest of honor. The first course had barely been cleared when Spencer decided to make me the evening's entertainment. He swirled his vintage red wine, a condescending smirk playing on his lips, as he leaned across the expensive crystal centerpieces. So Nia, Spencer began, his voice projecting loudly enough to force a dead pause in the conversations around us. "Chloe tells me you are still playing around with that little internet project of yours. What was it again? A website for tracking shipping boxes. Are you still running that out of your spare bedroom?" I kept my posture rigidly straight, refusing to let him see the anger bubbling beneath my skin. I maintained steady, cold eye contact. "It is an artificial intelligence-driven supply chain management platform. It optimizes global logistics and inventory tracking for luxury retail brands. I am currently pitching for seed funding and finalizing beta testing with 2 major European distributors. It is a highly scalable software solution, Spencer." Chloe let out a high, melodic laugh that sounded exactly like breaking glass. "Seed funding. That is just a polite Silicon Valley way of saying you are begging for money on the internet, right? You should really let Spencer look at your business plan, Nia. Assuming you actually have one. He just closed a $50 million real estate acquisition fund for Daddy last week. He knows what real investors want to see." My father beamed at Spencer, proudly raising his crystal wineglass in a silent toast. That he did. Spencer understands how the real world operates. He understands tangible value. My father then turned his heavy, judging gaze toward me, and the warmth completely vanished from his eyes. "You are 34 years old, Nia. It is time to stop playing these startup games. You are about to marry Marcus. He is on track to make senior partner at his law firm. Your focus should be on supporting his political and social ascent, not chasing pipe dreams that burn a hole in your savings account." A wife's job is to elevate her husband's standing, not distract from it with hobbies. Spencer leaned back in his leather dining chair, looking at me with pure, patronizing pity. He adjusted his expensive silk tie. Your father is absolutely right, Nia. This family needs practical investments. We deal in tangible assets, commercial properties, real money. We do not need some pie in the sky lines of code. Tech startups are a dime a dozen, and statistically, women with no financial backing fail within the first year. You should focus on picking out floral arrangements for the wedding and let the men handle the capital. I looked around the massive dining room. Dozens of elite guests, my mother, my father, my own sister. Not a single person stepped in to defend me. My mother was actually nodding in agreement, murmuring her approval of Spencer's brilliant financial insight. I was sitting right there, a grown woman with a brilliant mind and a highly viable business model, being treated like a foolish, naive child who did not understand the basic value of a dollar. They looked at me with such profound disappointment, as if my ambition to build an empire of my own was a direct insult to our family legacy. I gripped my heavy linen napkin under the table until my knuckles turned completely white. I was suffocating inside their beautiful toxic glass house, trapped by the crushing weight of their expectations and their relentless need to break my spirit. The heavy mahogany doors to the formal dining room swung open, offering a brief interruption to my public humiliation. The atmosphere in the room instantly shifted from suffocating tension to an almost theatrical reverence. Camille Sterling had arrived. She was supposedly my best friend, a bond forged during our undergraduate years, but looking at her now, she felt like a perfectly crafted weapon designed specifically to highlight every flaw my family saw in me. Camille was the absolute epitome of Atlanta old money. Her family wealth was quiet, generational, and steeped in decades of untouchable prestige. She floated into the room wearing a vintage silk emerald gown that whispered rather than shouted, her posture radiating the effortless superiority of a woman who had never been told she was not enough. She bypassed me entirely, gliding directly toward the head of the table. In her hands, she carried a wooden box. She presented it to my father with a smile so sugary sweet, it practically dripped. It was a 1982 Chateau Mouton Rothschild. I watched my father, a man who rarely showed genuine delight, unless he was closing a commercial real estate acquisition, completely melt. He took the bottle with both hands, his eyes shining with profound admiration. "Camille, my dear," my father announced, his booming voice, commanding the attention of every politician and socialite in the room. "You always know exactly how to honor this family. Your taste is absolutely impeccable. You carry the Sterling legacy with such phenomenal grace." I sat frozen in my chair. He had not looked at me with that level of respect in my entire life. But the true gut punch did not come from my father. It came from the man sitting directly to my left. Marcus, my fiancé, the aggressive, ambitious mergers and acquisitions lawyer I was supposed to marry in less than a month, practically leaped out of his seat. He abandoned his conversation, abandoned my side, and rushed around the table to pull out the chair adjacent to his own for Camille. As I watched them from across the table, my vision seemed to tunnel. I looked past Marcus's broad shoulder, my focus snapping sharply between the back of his tailored suit and Camille's flawlessly contoured face. The physical distance between them was entirely inappropriate for a man engaged to another woman. Marcus leaned down as she took her seat, his hand resting on the bare skin of her lower back, for 3 seconds too long. He whispered something close to her ear. I watched Camille's eyes flutter, a coy, secretive smile playing on her lips, before she looked up at him through her thick lashes. They were sharing a private joke right in front of me. Marcus poured her water, adjusted her silverware, and hovered over her with an intense, desperate devotion he had never not once shown to me. He looked at Camille the way a starving man looks at a feast. And more sickeningly, he looked at her the way an M&A lawyer looks at the ultimate corporate merger. The dinner service continued, but the true main course was the public dissection of my worth. My father uncorked the vintage wine Camille had brought, pouring the first glass specifically for her. He raised his crystal goblet, demanding the table's attention once more. To Camille, my father declared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. A brilliant woman who understands that a true society wife builds her empire by elevating her community. Camille just secured a massive grant for the Children's Hospital wing, utilizing her family's incredible network. She understands the power of tangible influence. He paused, turning his heavy gaze toward me, ensuring every guest was watching the comparison unfold. He gestured toward me with a dismissive wave of his hand. Nia, you could learn a great deal from your friend. This is what real legacy building looks like. While you are locked in your bedroom playing around with computer codes and begging strangers for internet funding, Camille is out here doing the actual work of a sophisticated woman. Marcus needs a partner who understands this world. I pray some of her refinement rubs off on you before the wedding for Marcus's sake. A chorus of polite murmuring agreement rippled through the guests. My mother nodded approvingly, raising her glass to Camille. Chloe and Spencer exchanged a knowing, satisfied smirk. I sat perfectly still, the heat of intense humiliation burning the back of my neck. I looked at Marcus silently, begging him to say something to defend the woman he was supposed to vow his life to. I needed him to tell my father that my artificial intelligence platform was brilliant, that my dedication to my tech company was a strength, that he loved my ambition exactly the way it was. Instead, Marcus raised his glass toward my father, a smooth, calculated smile on his handsome face. You are absolutely right, sir. Camille sets a phenomenal standard. We are all incredibly lucky to have her guidance. He then turned to Camille, clinking his glass against hers, their eyes locking in a gaze so intense it made my stomach violently turn. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. I stopped hearing the clatter of silver forks against expensive china. I stopped hearing the jazz music floating from the grand piano in the corner. All I could hear was the rushing of my own blood. I looked at my father, who was watching Marcus and Camille with a deep, calculating satisfaction. I looked at Marcus, whose ambition was practically radiating off him as he catered to Camille's every need. I looked at Camille, who caught my eye over the rim of her wine glass, her lips curling into a tiny, victorious smile that completely betrayed her innocent facade. In that terrifyingly clear moment, the puzzle pieces violently snapped together in my mind. This was not just a dinner party. This was not just casual disrespect or typical family toxicity. This was an audition, and I had just been openly replaced. My father was obsessed with securing generational wealth and corporate dominance. Marcus was a shark of a lawyer desperate to make partner and secure a seat at the tables of the old money elite. And Camille was the golden ticket. She had the pedigree, the trust fund, the flawless social standing, and the absolute willingness to play the subservient, elegant society wife that my father demanded and Marcus required. They were not just humiliating me, they were phasing me out. I was the inconvenient, stubborn obstacle standing in the way of the perfect corporate and social merger. My own father was actively facilitating a connection between my fiancé and my best friend, right in front of my face. He was giving Marcus permission to look elsewhere, signaling that the Pierce family wealth would still support him as long as he aligned himself with the right kind of woman. A woman who was not me. I did not touch my food for the rest of the evening. I sat in my expensive chair wearing the painful hairstyle my mother had forced upon me, slowly realizing that the people I loved most in the world were quietly conspiring to destroy my future. The betrayal was not a sudden explosion. It was a slow, calculated poison, and they were making me swallow it in front of a live audience. The days that followed that dinner party blurred together in a suffocating haze of wedding preparations and unspoken truths. My entire existence felt unsteady, as if the ground beneath my feet was constantly vibrating with a low, threatening hum. I could not sleep. My heart raced a million miles a minute every time Marcus's phone buzzed, or every time my mother sent over another aggressive demand regarding the wedding guest list. I was functioning on pure adrenaline and a sickening sense of dread, trying desperately to hold on to the life I thought I was building. The first undeniable crack in Marcus's perfect facade appeared on a rainy Tuesday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen island of our shared downtown condo, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop. I was supposed to be reviewing vendor contracts for my supply chain startup, but I had opened our joint banking portal to pay the deposit for the wedding florist. That was when I saw it. There was a pending charge for $22,000 at a highly exclusive appointment-only jeweler in Buckhead. My breath caught in my throat. We had already purchased our wedding bands months ago, and my engagement ring was sitting heavy on my finger. There was absolutely no logical reason for a $22,000 jewelry purchase 3 weeks before our wedding. I heard the shower turn off down the hall. I weighted my chest tight until Marcus walked into the kitchen, buttoning his crisp white dress shirt. He looked completely at ease, humming a low tune as he reached for the coffee pot. I turned the laptop screen toward him. "Marcus," I said, forcing my voice to remain perfectly level despite the violent shaking in my hands. "Can you explain this charge from Beaumont Jewelers?" He did not even flinch. He poured his coffee, took a slow sip, and glanced at the screen with an expression of mild annoyance. He looked at me the exact same way my father did when dealing with a slow employee. "It is a corporate gift, Nia," he said smoothly, adjusting his expensive silk tie in the reflection of the microwave. "One of our firm's biggest clients just finalized a merger, and his daughter is getting married this weekend. The senior partners decided a substantial wedding gift was the right move to secure their ongoing retainer. I put it on the joint card for the reward points. The firm is reimbursing me by Friday." I stared at him, searching his face for any micro-expression of guilt. There was none. He was a master negotiator, trained to lie with a straight face and absolute conviction. $22,000 is a lot for a client's daughter. I pressed, refusing to back down. "Why didn't you mention it to me?" Marcus sighed, setting his coffee mug down with a sharp clink. "Because it is a business expense, Nia. It is standard operating procedure in high-level corporate law. You would understand that if you were not so isolated in your spare bedroom playing with your little tech project. Relationship building at the highest tier requires capital. Please do not turn into one of those paranoid nagging fiancés. I have a massive day ahead of me, and I cannot deal with your insecurity right now." He kissed my forehead, a cold, dismissive gesture, grabbed his briefcase, and walked out the door. He flipped the script flawlessly, making me feel unreasonable and entirely crazy for questioning a massive financial discrepancy. I was left alone in the kitchen, feeling foolish, but utterly unconvinced. The seed of doubt had been planted, and its roots were spreading fast. That afternoon, I was summoned to my parents' estate to review the final seating charts for the wedding reception. When I arrived, my mother was conveniently out running errands, leaving me alone in the sunroom with my younger sister. Chloe was lounging on a velvet chaise, sipping a green juice and casually scrolling through her phone. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes lighting up with that familiar predatory gleam she always got right before she decided to ruin my day. "Nia," she purred, setting her phone face down on the glass table. "You look exhausted. Wedding planning must really be taking its toll on you. Or maybe it is just the stress of trying to keep Marcus entertained." I ignored the bait, unrolling the massive seating chart blueprints on the table. "We need to finalize the arrangement for the corporate tables, Chloe. Dad wants Spencer seated next to the venture capital group." Chloe waved her hand dismissively, not even glancing at the blueprints. "Oh, Spencer is handling his own networking. You know who else is doing a phenomenal job at networking right now? Marcus. He is just so dedicated to his career." I kept my eyes on the papers. "Yes, he is working very hard on a major merger." Chloe let out a sharp, knowing laugh. "A merger. Is that what he is calling it? Because from what Spencer tells me, Marcus has been spending an awful lot of time over at the Sterling Foundation headquarters. You know, Camille's family office." My hands stopped moving. I forced myself to look up at her. "Camille is revamping their charitable trusts. Marcus's firm handles their legal work." "Right," Chloe said, leaning forward with a malicious, glittering smile. "Legal work. It is just so fascinating how much legal work requires late evening meetings behind closed doors." Spencer saw Marcus's car parked outside Camille's private office building at 9 o'clock last night, and the night before that. They must be working incredibly hard on those charitable trusts. It is so generous of your fiancé to give your best friend so much of his personal time right before your wedding. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her green juice, her eyes locked onto mine, watching the impact of her words land. She knew exactly what she was implying. She was practically feeding me the poison and demanding I thank her for the taste. "He is advising her, board," I said defensively, my voice sounding incredibly hollow even to my own ears. Chloe shrugged, a gesture of absolute fake innocence. "If you say so, Nia. I am just saying Camille is looking absolutely radiant lately, and Marcus seems very happy to be assisting her. I just hope you are paying attention. It would be a tragedy if you were completely blindsided because you were too busy staring at your computer screen to notice what is happening in the real world." She stood up, grabbed her designer purse, and strutted out of the sunroom, leaving me completely alone with the blueprints of a wedding that suddenly felt like a massive, impending funeral. My chest tightened until I could barely draw breath. The $22,000 jewelry charge, the late nights, the lingering touches at the dinner party, the way my father had publicly endorsed Camille. It was all spiraling together into a horrifying, undeniable truth. I was not just being phased out socially. I was being actively betrayed by the man I shared my bed with and the woman I called my sister. And my own family was sitting back eating popcorn and watching the entire execution take place. The crushing weight of Chloe's insinuations paralyzed me for hours. By the time evening fell, I was suffocating in my own home, waiting for Marcus to return, but his text message said he was locked in another late-night deposition. I knew it was a lie. Tomorrow was supposed to be the final fitting for my custom wedding gown, a highly orchestrated event my mother had demanded take place at their estate. I drove to my parents' house under the guise of dropping off my bridal accessories early, but in reality, I was desperately searching for answers. I needed to look my parents in the eye. I needed to see if they knew what Marcus was doing. The sprawling Buckhead mansion was eerily quiet when I let myself in. The grand chandelier in the foyer was dimmed, casting long, stretching shadows across the imported marble floors. I slipped off my heels, the cold stone biting into my bare feet as I moved silently down the vast, vaulted hallway. My heart hammered against my ribs with a frantic, irregular rhythm. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around and leave, but the desperate need for the truth pulled me forward. As I neared the east wing, a sliver of warm golden light spilled out from my father's private study. The heavy mahogany door had been left slightly ajar. The faint scent of aged bourbon and expensive cigar smoke drifted into the corridor. I crept closer, pressing my back flat against the cold patterned wallpaper, holding my breath, until my lungs burned. I heard the distinct clink of crystal glasses meeting in a toast. Then my father's deep, commanding voice resonated through the quiet room. It was not the voice of a father preparing to give his daughter away. It was the calculated, ruthless tone he used when closing a hostile corporate takeover. "You handled the Sterling account masterfully this week, Marcus," my father said. "Camille's father was incredibly impressed with your legal maneuvering. He called me this afternoon to personally express his gratitude." "Thank you, Julian Marcus," replied, his voice dripping with that smooth, eager-to-please ambition I had once mistaken for charm. Camille made the introduction seamless. She understands the nuances of her family's board perfectly. We make a highly effective team. "Exactly," my mother Vivian chimed in. Her voice was sharp, elegant, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Teamwork is everything at this echelon of society. A man in your position, Marcus, a man destined for political office and senior partnership, requires a wife who inherently understands the assignment, a woman who elevates the room the moment she walks into it." I squeezed my eyes shut, my nails digging so hard into my palms that they broke the skin. "I agree," Vivian Marcus sighed, sounding almost burdened. "But the wedding is in less than a month. The invitations have been sent. The optics of calling it off now would be a public relations nightmare for both the firm and your family." "Optics can be carefully managed." "Marcus," my mother countered swiftly, brushing off the destruction of my wedding like it was a minor scheduling conflict. "A canceled wedding is a temporary society gossip item. A mismatched marriage is a lifelong liability. You have seen how Nia behaves. She insists on wearing her hair in those distracting natural styles to critical donor dinners. She embarrasses us by talking about her little tech startup when she should be networking with the wives of hospital board members. She simply refuses to adapt. I clamped a hand over my own mouth to stifle the physical gasp that tore at my throat. My own mother was actively pitching my replacement to my fiancé. Then my father delivered the killing blow. Nia is far too stubborn and completely lacks the class of a true society wife, Julian stated coldly, sealing my fate with the strike of an invisible gavel. She is my daughter, and I will always provide for her, but she is a terrible investment for your future, Marcus. Camille is the key for you to enter the investment fund's board of directors. Her family's trust controls 3 major voting blocks. You marry Camille and your path to the Senate is paved in absolute gold. Do not ruin your political and financial future over a few years of sentiment with my daughter. The silence that followed was the loudest, most deafening sound I had ever heard in my entire life. I waited for Marcus to push back. I waited for him to say that 5 years of love, loyalty, and partnership meant more to him than a seat on a board of directors. I waited for the man who proposed to me on a moonlit beach to defend my honor. You are right, Julian Marcus said quietly. I love Nia, I really do. But love does not win elections or secure generational wealth. Camille and I have already discussed the transition. We will announce the split, mutually cite irreconcilable differences, and wait an appropriate 6 months before making our relationship public. A wise decision, son, my father replied, the satisfaction practically oozing from his words. You are making the right choice for the empire. I stood frozen in this dark hallway, the shadows wrapping around me like a burial shroud. This was not a tragic affair born out of sudden passion or a mistake made in the heat of the moment. This was a premeditated, fully sanctioned corporate merger. My best friend, my fiancé, and my own parents had sat in a room and calculated my exact depreciation value. They had looked at my ambition, my pride, and my unyielding sense of self and decided I was a defective asset that needed to be liquidated. The physical pain in my chest was absolute agony, as if my heart were being crushed in a vice. Every memory of my father patting Marcus on the back, every time my mother praised Camille's elegance, every late night Marcus claimed he was working on a brief, it all crashed down on me in a devastating avalanche of truth. I was the fool who believed in family loyalty. They were the sharks who believed only in power. I understand. Sir Marcus's voice drifted through the narrow crack in the door. His tone was brisk, professional, and utterly devoid of remorse. It was the exact voice he used when finalizing a lucrative corporate contract. Camille and I have completely aligned on the timeline. Next week, right after the Sterling Foundation Charity Gala concludes, I will formally call off the engagement with Nia. We will frame it as a mutual decision to minimize any immediate public fallout. Excellent, my mother murmured. I could hear the sharp, satisfied clink of her crystal glass against my father's. Clean, efficient, and absolutely the right move for the portfolio. The polished marble floors beneath my feet seemed to slant violently. The perfectly straight walls of my father's extravagant hallway bowed inward, threatening to crush me. The entire axis of my world tilted sharply, throwing my reality completely off balance. I pressed my hands flat against the cold wallpaper to keep myself from collapsing. Any normal woman would have kicked that heavy mahogany door wide open. Any normal bride would have stormed into that study, screamed until her lungs gave out, shattered those crystal glasses, and demanded answers for the sheer, suffocating cruelty of it all. I should have wept. I should have fallen to my knees and begged the man I loved to tell me this was some horrible, twisted nightmare. But the tears never came. The profound magnitude of their treachery bypassed my emotions entirely and settled directly into my bones as a freezing, absolute certainty. I did not want to scream. I did not want their apologies because an apology implies a mistake, and this was not a mistake. This was a calculated assassination of my future. They had sold me. My own flesh and blood, the parents who were supposed to protect me from the wolves of the world, had invited the wolves to the dining table, poured them vintage wine, and served my heart on a silver platter. I pushed myself off the wall. My movements were mechanical, precise, and unnaturally quiet. I retraced my steps through the sprawling, silent corridors of the estate. Every framed portrait I passed, every smiling family photograph carefully curated by my mother, felt like a grotesque, mocking lie. I slipped upstairs and into my childhood bedroom, the room they had insisted I use to store my bridal accessories before the final fitting tomorrow. My custom silk wedding dress hung from the closet door. It looked like a pristine white ghost haunting the dimly lit room. It was a symbol of a future that never actually existed. Marcus had never loved me. He had loved the access my last name provided. He loved the doors my father could open for him. And the very moment a better, more compliant access point presented itself in the form of Camille, he traded me in without a single second of hesitation. My best friend. The woman who had held my hand through college exams and celebrated my first major coding milestone. Camille had sat on my sofa just 3 days ago, drinking my wine and helping me pick out floral arrangements, all while she was sleeping with my fiancé and negotiating my exit strategy with my father. The sheer sociopathy required to execute a betrayal of that magnitude was almost impressive. I stood in the center of the room, my breathing finally slowing down to a steady rhythmic pace. The dizzying tilt of my reality stabilized into a hardened, lethal focus. I saw them all with terrifying clarity. They thought I was just a stubborn, overly emotional woman who would quietly accept her dismissal to preserve the family's precious public image. They expected me to retreat to cry in the shadows, and to eventually attend their country club dinners, while pretending my spirit had not been ripped out by my own father. They thought I would play the role of the tragic, jilted ex-fiancé, so they could easily transition Marcus and Camille into Atlanta's newest power couple. They severely underestimated me. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out the heavy velvet box containing my engagement ring. The massive diamond selected by my mother for its sheer visual impact and paid for by Marcus's relentless ambition sparkled coldly under the ambient light of the bedroom. I did not throw it against the wall. I did not flush it down the drain. I walked over to the pristine, untouched mattress and set the velvet box carefully right in the dead center of the bed. I took the bridal accessories, the pearl earrings my mother had demanded I wear, and placed them neatly right beside the ring. I was leaving it all behind. The fake love, the conditional family loyalty, the suffocating expectations, and the entire toxic empire. I walked out of my childhood room, descended the grand staircase one last time, and slipped out the front door into the cool, humid Atlanta night. I did not leave a dramatic note. I did not send a fiery text message. Silence was a weapon they had taught me how to use flawlessly, and I was about to use it to orchestrate my complete, untraceable disappearance. I drove back to the downtown condo I shared with Marcus. The city lights blurred past my windshield, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I walked into the condo and went straight to my home office. I did not pack clothes or sentimental trinkets. I packed my servers, my hard drives, and the proprietary blueprints for my artificial intelligence platform. That code was my actual future. It was the empire I was going to build with my own 2 hands. I logged into our joint banking portal, withdrew exactly half of the funds we had contributed to the wedding, and transferred them to an offshore account I had set up for my business. Then I booked a one-way ticket to Barcelona, Spain. A city where no one cared about my father's legacy. A city where I could build a fortress they could never breach. I had booked the ticket to Barcelona. My bags were packed. The servers containing my life's work were secured. But as the sun began to rise over the Atlanta skyline, illuminating the city, I was about to abandon, a new fiery realization washed over me. Slipping away into the night like a defeated victim was exactly what they expected. It was too easy. It was too quiet. They wanted a smooth, carefully managed transition where they completely controlled the narrative. I decided right then that I was not going to give them a convenient exit. I grabbed the velvet box containing the engagement ring off the mattress, got back into my car, and drove straight back to my parents' estate. The morning sun was violently bright as I pulled through the iron gates. The massive house loomed before me, no longer a home, but an active crime scene. I marched through the front doors, my footsteps echoing loudly against the marble foyer. The heavy velvet box burned a hole in my palm. I could hear the faint clinking of fine china and the low, arrogant hum of their voices, coming from the formal breakfast room. They were all gathered there. My father, my mother, Chloe, Spencer, and Marcus. They were drinking freshly squeezed orange juice and eating imported pastries, perfectly content in their shared sickening betrayal. I pushed the double glass doors open with enough force to make them slam against the adjacent walls. The conversation stopped instantly. 5 heads snapped toward me. Marcus stood up immediately. He pasted on that fake concerned smile he used for the public and started walking toward me. He opened his mouth to ask where I had been all night, playing the role of the devoted, worried fiancé to absolute perfection. I did not let him finish his sentence. I raised my arm and hurled the heavy velvet box directly at his face with every ounce of strength I had left. The box struck him squarely on the cheekbone with a sharp, satisfying thud before clattering onto the pristine marble floor. The massive diamond ring tumbled out, spinning pathetically near his Italian leather shoes. Marcus staggered back, raising a hand to his bruising cheek, his eyes wide with genuine shock. The room erupted into chaos. My mother gasped, clutching her chest. Chloe spilled her mimosa. Spencer jumped up from his chair. My father glared at me, his face instantly turning a deep shade of crimson. I did not give a single one of them a chance to speak. I looked Marcus dead in the eye, my voice slicing through the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. I told him I heard every single word in the study last night. I looked at my father and recited his exact quotes about Camille being the key to the investment board. I looked at my mother and repeated her disgusting comment about managing the optics of a canceled wedding. I laid every single card on the table, exposing their entire corporate merger that they were trying to disguise as a romantic transition. I told Marcus that Camille was welcome to the scraps of a relationship he was offering, because I refused to be a pawn in his desperate, pathetic climb to the top of the social ladder. I expected frantic denial. I expected them to scramble for excuses or attempt to gaslight me into believing I had misunderstood the conversation. But the sheer audacity of my family went far beyond normal human decency. The initial shock on their faces almost immediately hardened into cold defensive rage. My mother stood up, smoothing the front of her designer morning gown. She did not express a single ounce of remorse for selling out her own flesh and blood. Instead, she pointed a manicured finger at me, her face twisting with pure contempt. She told me to stop acting like a hysterical, ungrateful child. She raised her voice, her tone echoing off the walls, declaring that men of Marcus's caliber need a wife who actually elevates them in elite social circles, not a girl who only knows how to aggressively type on a keyboard in a dark room. She stated that I lacked the fundamental grace to survive in their echelon of society, and that Camille was simply a better return on investment. She looked me up and down and explicitly said I was a social liability who stubbornly refused to play the game. My father did not flinch at my mother's cruelty. He slammed his fist onto the breakfast table, rattling the expensive china and silencing everyone else in the room. He did not apologize for orchestrating my heartbreak. He stepped forward, radiating tyrannical anger. He called me a selfish, narrow-minded embarrassment. He shouted that I was actively trying to destroy the grand scheme of the family legacy because of my fragile ego. He told me that real business requires sacrifice, and that if I could not understand the strategic value of aligning Marcus with the Sterling family trust, I was too foolish to bear the Pierce name. He pointed at the ring on the floor and demanded I pick it up, insisting we would proceed with a quiet mutual separation, exactly as he had commanded. I looked at Spencer, who was rolling his eyes and muttering about how I was overreacting to basic networking strategies. I looked at Chloe, who sat back down, thoroughly enjoying my execution. And finally, I looked back at Marcus. The man who had promised to love me forever was standing completely silent behind my father, letting them tear me to shreds. He was a coward. I stood my ground. I felt no tears, no sorrow, only a profound, clarifying rage that fortified my spine into steel. I looked at the people who were supposed to be my family, and I felt absolutely nothing but disgust. I told them they were morally bankrupt. I told them their money was covered in dirt, and their legacy was nothing but a hollow shell built on lies and manipulation. I announced that there would be no quiet mutual separation. I was burning the bridge completely. I turned my back on them, ignoring my father's furious demands to come back, and walked out of the breakfast room. I left the diamond ring sitting on the cold floor, right where it belonged. I strode down the sweeping hallway toward the grand marble foyer, my heart pounding with a fierce, untamed rhythm. I had already transferred my own funds. I had my passport. My 2 suitcases packed with everything that actually mattered to my business and my life were waiting right beside the massive front doors. I had hauled them inside with me, a physical testament to my permanent departure. I reached for the handle of my luggage, ready to walk out into the humid morning air, when a slow, mocking clap echoed behind me. I turned to see Spencer leaning casually against the mahogany banister. He had followed me out of the breakfast room, slipping effortlessly into his role as my father's corporate fixer. He held a crisp, folded piece of paper between his fingers, his face twisted into that familiar, infuriating smirk. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic," Nia Spencer drawled, pushing himself off the banister and walking slowly toward me. He adjusted his expensive cuffs, looking at me as if I were a terminated employee, causing an embarrassing scene in a corporate lobby. "But let us be pragmatic for a single second. We both know your little startup is bleeding cash. Pride is a wonderful thing, but it does not pay for server hosting, marketing campaigns, or downtown rent." I stared at him, my expression completely blank. I did not say a word. I just waited for him to reveal exactly how low my family was willing to go to protect their public image. He held out the piece of paper. It was a certified bank check. "Julian and I anticipated you might react poorly to the transition. We know you are emotional right now. Consider this a generous severance package from the Pierce Family Trust. It is $250,000. Take the money, Nia. Go back to your apartment, stay quiet, and let Marcus and Camille announce their relationship next month without any of this messy interference. It is a massive win for everyone. You get your much-needed funding, and the family protects its vital investments." I looked down at the check. $250,000. To them, that was the exact price of my silence. That was the calculated compensation for 5 years of my life, my broken engagement, and my dignity. They were trying to buy my compliance just like they bought country club memberships and political favors. They genuinely believed that everyone had a price tag, and they assumed mine was pathetically cheap. I did not reach for the paper. I looked Spencer dead in the eyes, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet volume. "You actually think you can buy my silence with the same dirty money you use to inflate your own pathetic ego?" Spencer scoffed, his smirk faltering just a fraction as his frustration leaked through. "Do not be stupid. You are walking away with absolutely nothing. Your father will freeze every account tied to your name by noon today. He will call his contacts in the banking sector and make sure no legitimate venture capitalist in Atlanta even looks at your business plan. You will be bankrupt before your flight even takes off. Take the check and be grateful you are getting anything at all." I stepped closer to him, invading his personal space until he was forced to step back. "You listen to me very carefully, Spencer. I do not want a single cent from the Pierce family empire. I do not want your hush money. I do not want my father's conditional funds. I am leaving this house with the exact same brilliance and determination I brought into it. You can take that check, hand it back to my father, and tell him to use it to buy himself a conscience, because God knows he cannot afford one otherwise." My father and mother had just stepped into the foyer, catching the tail end of my absolute rejection. My father's face was a mask of furious disbelief. He was a man who believed every single person could be bought, and my refusal to accept his payout was a direct challenge to his absolute authority. "If you walk out that door without signing this agreement, you are stripped of the Pierce name entirely." My father boomed, his voice vibrating through the cavernous room. "You will receive no inheritance. You will have no access to my network. You will be entirely cut off from the society that raised you. I will make sure everyone in our circle knows you had a mental breakdown and abandoned your duties. You will be nothing but a cautionary tale." My mother stood beside him, her arms crossed tight against her chest. She looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disdain. "You will come crawling back the moment your little tech project fails," she sneered. You have never survived outside of our protection. And when you do run out of money and realize how hard the real world actually is, do not expect us to open these doors for you. I grabbed the handles of my suitcases. I felt a surge of adrenaline so powerful it completely washed away any lingering trace of sorrow or heartbreak. I looked at the three of them standing there in their pristine, luxurious fortress. They looked so small. They looked so incredibly hollow. Their entire lives were dictated by balance sheets and public perception. I am not coming back, I stated, my voice echoing off the marble floors with absolute unwavering certainty. You do not get to fire me from a family I am actively quitting. From this exact second forward, you have no eldest daughter. You have no right to speak my name. You have no claim to my future successes, and you absolutely will not be permitted to witness my life. I paused, making sure my final words would burn themselves into their memories permanently. I am walking out of this house, and you will never know where I am going. You will never know what I am building. You will never know if I am married, if I have children, or if I am successful. You will not even know if I am dead or alive. You traded me for a corporate merger, and now you have to live with that transaction forever. I turned my back on them for the final time. I pushed open the massive, heavy oak front doors and stepped out into the blinding morning sunlight. The heat of the Atlanta summer hit my skin, but I had never felt more refreshed. I gripped my luggage and walked down the wide stone steps. I did not look over my shoulder. I could hear my father shouting my name, demanding I come back inside, but his voice sounded distant and utterly powerless. I kept walking, each step carrying me further away from their toxic expectations. The sprawling estate, the perfectly manicured lawns, the suffocating wealth, all of it shrank behind me as the distance grew. I was completely alone, dragging my heavy suitcases down the long, winding driveway toward the front gates. The sheer magnitude of my isolation surrounded me in the vast open space of the driveway, but it did not crush me. Instead, it fueled me. As I loaded my bags into the trunk of my car and started the engine, a profound, undeniable sense of liberation rushed through my veins. I was entirely cut off. I had no safety net. I had no family to fall back on. I had just rejected a fortune and embraced total uncertainty, but I was finally completely free. And that freedom was worth infinitely more than any check they could ever write. The drive down the interstate to Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport was an absolute blur of adrenaline. I did not shed a single tear. I did not check my rearview mirror. Every mile that put distance between me and my father's gated estate felt like shedding a heavy, suffocating layer of armor I had been forced to wear my entire life. I abandoned my car in the long-term parking garage, tossing the keys into the center console. My father had paid for the vehicle, and he could send one of his corporate assistants to retrieve it whenever he eventually tracked the GPS. I no longer wanted anything that bore the invisible strings of his wealth. Inside the massive, echoing terminal, the harsh fluorescent lights of Atlanta felt appropriately sterile. This was the city that had demanded my compliance, and now it was the city I was actively escaping. I bypassed the automated kiosks and walked straight up to the international ticketing counter. I had the offshore funds I had transferred the night before, a painfully modest sum compared to the vast wealth of the Pierce family empire, but it was all I legitimately owned. I looked the ticketing agent in the eye and asked for the next available one-way ticket to Barcelona, Spain. The transaction drained a terrifying portion of my remaining capital. Watching my account balance plummet was a stark reminder of the safety net I was abandoning. But as the printer whirred and spat out that thin piece of cardstock, it felt like the most valuable document I had ever held. It was my formal declaration of independence. With 2 hours until boarding, I found an isolated corner near my departure gate. The real work had to begin immediately. My father was a man of immense resources and terrifying reach. If he wanted to find me, he would employ elite private investigators, track my digital footprint, and freeze any financial or social account tied to his corporate umbrella. I had to become an absolute ghost. I opened my laptop and powered on my phone. The screen was already flooded with incoming texts and missed calls. Marcus was trying to call. Chloe was sending furious, mocking text messages about my dramatic exit. My mother was leaving voicemails demanding I stop this embarrassing tantrum and return home immediately to apologize. I did not listen to a single one. I went into my settings and started the systematic execution of my past. Marcus Davenport, blocked. Chloe Pierce, blocked. Spencer, blocked. My mother, blocked. My father, blocked. Then came the broader social execution. I logged into the carefully curated social media profiles that documented my elite, suffocating life as a Pierce. The photos of charity galas, country club luncheons, and fake smiling family portraits. I did not just deactivate the accounts, I permanently deleted them. I wiped my cloud storage, disconnected my device location services, and routed my new business servers through a heavily encrypted virtual private network. I contacted my cellular provider and completely terminated the phone number I had used for the last 10 years. I removed the SIM card, snapped it in half, and dropped the pieces into a nearby trash can. I watched the progress bars on my laptop load as every digital tether to my previous existence was aggressively severed. I was burning my own identity to the ground so that a new one could grow from the ashes. By the time my father realized I was truly gone, there would be absolutely nothing left to track. The boarding call echoed through the terminal. I snapped my laptop shut, picked up my heavy suitcases, and walked toward the gate without a single ounce of hesitation. The transatlantic flight was a brutal, necessary transition between two completely different realities. As the plane climbed rapidly above the clouds, leaving the humid, oppressive grip of the American South behind, the exhaustion of the past 24 hours finally collided with my adrenaline. I slept a deep, dreamless sleep, wrapped in the quiet hum of the jet engines. When I finally woke up, the captain was announcing our descent into Spain. I lifted the plastic window shade. The rigid, calculated grid of Atlanta had been replaced by the vibrant, sprawling, organic coastline of the Mediterranean Sea. When the heavy cabin doors opened, the shift in the atmosphere was instantaneous. I stepped out of the terminal at El Prat Airport, and the sterile, icy chill of my past was completely swallowed by the warm, golden heat of the Spanish sun. It wrapped around me like a heavy, comforting blanket. The air smelled of salt old stone and sheer possibility. The lighting of my life had fundamentally changed from a cold, clinical interrogation room to a vibrant, warm canvas. But the romanticized notion of starting over in a beautiful European city quickly collided with the brutal, unforgiving reality of sheer survival. I was a Black woman in her 30s, standing completely alone in a foreign country, possessing only a rudimentary grasp of the language and a bank account that was depleting by the minute. I could not afford to play tourist. I could not afford to rest. I had to go to war for my own future. Within 48 hours, I rented a tiny, incredibly cramped studio apartment in the gritty El Raval neighborhood. It was a grueling fifth-floor walk-up with peeling yellow paint, unpredictable plumbing, and barely enough physical space to open both of my suitcases at the same time. The single window looked out over a narrow, noisy alleyway instead of a manicured estate garden. It was a massive, shocking downgrade from a Buckhead mansion, but to me, it was an absolute palace because it was entirely mine. No one could tell me how to dress inside those walls. No one could tell me my ambitions were a joke. I pushed the small, rickety kitchen table against the peeling wall and unpacked my servers. I set up my monitors, untangled my cables, and booted up my artificial intelligence platform. The glow of the screens was the only luxury I needed. I instituted a ruthless military-grade routine. I survived on cheap espresso local bread and an ironclad determination to never let my family be right about me. My mother had sworn I would come crawling back the moment I realized how hard the real world actually was. My father had promised I would be bankrupt before the week was over. Every time my hands cramped from typing, every time the panic of isolation threatened to suffocate me in that tiny apartment, I thought of Marcus and Camille laughing in my father's study. I used that profound betrayal as pure, unadulterated fuel. I coded late into the night, optimizing my supply chain algorithms, building presentations, and cold emailing European distributors. The battle for my survival on foreign soil had officially begun, and I was prepared to fight until my last breath to build an empire that would eventually eclipse the very people who threw me away. The first 2 years in Barcelona were a brutal, blinding montage of absolute isolation and relentless obsession. If you stood in the center of my cramped El Raval apartment and spun in a slow, continuous circle, you would see the exact same scene repeating day after day, month after month. You would see me hunched over glowing monitors, the harsh blue light illuminating the dark, exhausted circles under my eyes. You would see empty coffee cups piling up winter rain, streaking the narrow glass window, transitioning into the blinding glare of the Spanish summer, and then fading right back into winter again. Time did not exist as a linear concept anymore. It was measured entirely in lines of code, algorithmic breakthroughs, and the rapidly shrinking balance in my offshore account. I was building a global luxury supply chain management system from scratch. I mapped out predictive models that could track a single silk thread from a supplier in Milan all the way to a boutique floor in Tokyo, identifying logistical bottlenecks before they even happened. I poured every ounce of my heartbreak, my anger, and my fierce independence into the architecture of the software. I did not go out for tapas. I did not walk down to the beautiful beaches. I barely spoke to another human being unless it was the local grocer down the street. The tiny apartment became a high-pressure cooker of ambition. I was physically exhausting myself, dropping weight, and running on dangerously low levels of sleep, but the platform was finally coming alive. The code was flawless. It was faster, smarter, and infinitely more scalable than anything currently operating in the European luxury market. When the beta version was completely stabilized and ready for market, I had to transition from a developer hidden in the shadows back into a CEO demanding a seat at the table. I bought a single perfectly tailored charcoal suit from a local vintage shop. I printed my pitch decks on thick, expensive paper. I stepped out of my tiny apartment and began knocking on the heavy gilded doors of Europe's most elite venture capital firms. That was when the real war began. I quickly discovered that the toxic, suffocating prejudices I thought I had left behind in Atlanta had simply packed their bags and crossed the ocean right alongside me. The venture capital landscape in Europe was heavily dominated by older, wealthy white men who looked at me not as a tech visionary, but as a statistical anomaly they wanted absolutely nothing to do with. I walked into towering glass boardrooms in Madrid, Paris, and Berlin, armed with a product that could genuinely revolutionize their retail portfolios. But before I even opened my laptop to demonstrate the software, I could see the decisions being made behind their eyes. I was a young Black American woman with natural hair, pitching a highly complex, aggressive artificial intelligence infrastructure. I did not look like the young hoodie-wearing male dropouts they were traditionally used to funding. I did not fit their deeply ingrained, biased profile of a tech founder. The rejections were constant, and they were always wrapped in insulting coded language. They would sit across their massive mahogany tables, steep their fingers together, and ask me if this was a passion project or a lifestyle brand. They looked at my revolutionary supply chain algorithm and asked if I had considered pivoting to a fashion blog or a boutique matchmaking service. One prominent French investor actually laughed out loud, patted my pitch deck, and told me that global logistics was a very aggressive field, heavily implying my delicate sensibilities would be better suited for digital marketing. Another group of German investors interrogated me for 3 agonizing hours, attempting to poke holes in my coding, only to finally reject me by claiming they just did not feel a cultural fit with my leadership style. They never criticized the technology because the technology was absolutely bulletproof. They criticized my mere existence in their space. Every rejection felt like a heavy concrete block being stacked on my chest. I was running out of capital. The small amount of money I had brought from America was drying up at a terrifying pace. I was eating cheap rice and beans, rationing my electricity, and patching holes in my only good pair of shoes with cardboard inserts. There was a particularly dark evening in November, exactly 18 months into my exile, when the crushing weight of it all nearly broke me. I had just received my 42nd official rejection email. The investor claimed my valuation was wildly optimistic for a sole female founder with no institutional backing. I sat on the floor of my freezing apartment, staring at the peeling yellow paint, and for one dangerous fleeting second, the voice of my father echoed in my head. I heard him telling Spencer that tech startups run by women fail within the first year. I heard my mother sneering that I would come crawling back the moment I realized how hard the real world actually was. The temptation to just quit was heavy, but the thought of Julian Pierce smiling with smug satisfaction was absolutely nauseating. I refused to give them the satisfaction of my failure. I refused to let a room full of biased, arrogant investors tell me what my brilliant mind was worth. I dragged myself off the cold floor, walked to the tiny bathroom sink, and splashed freezing water on my face. I looked at my reflection in the cracked mirror. I was tired, I was hungry, and I was broke. But I was not defeated. I went back to my desk, opened my laptop, and began researching a completely different tier of investors. I stopped aiming for the traditional conservative venture capital firms that wanted to play it safe with people who looked just like them. I started looking for the disruptors, the private equity mavericks, the people who operated in the aggressive shadows of the European market and valued ruthless innovation over traditional optics. I rewrote my entire pitch deck that night. I stripped away the polite, accommodating corporate language I had been using to make those older men comfortable. I made the presentation sharper, colder, and infinitely more demanding. I was no longer asking for a seat at their table. I was preparing to build my own table and buy the entire building. The relentless string of rejections had not broken my spirit. It had forged my business acumen into an absolute weapon, and I was finally ready to swing it. The opportunity to deploy my newly weaponized pitch came 3 weeks later at a massive invitation-only tech startup summit held in a sunlit modernist glass pavilion overlooking the Balearic Sea. It was not the stiff mahogany-lined boardrooms of traditional European banking. This was an aggressive high-stakes arena filled with private equity disruptors and shadow investors looking for the next digital revolution. The pavilion was flooded with brilliant, blinding natural light, a stark contrast to the dark, suffocating study where my father had negotiated my future. I walked into that venue wearing my tailored charcoal suit, my natural hair worn completely free and massive, a physical declaration that I was no longer shrinking myself for anyone's comfort. I stood on the main presentation stage and delivered my pitch with absolute unyielding precision. I did not smile to make the investors comfortable. I did not soften my tone. I presented my artificial intelligence supply chain algorithms as cold, hard mathematics that could completely dismantle and rebuild the current European luxury logistics market. I showed them the raw data, the projected efficiency metrics, and the exact millions they were currently losing by relying on antiquated tracking systems. When I finished, the silence in the room was palpable. The older traditional investors looked visibly intimidated by my aggression. They shifted uncomfortably in their expensive Italian suits. But as I scanned the crowd, my eyes locked onto a man standing completely still at the very back of the pavilion. He was not wearing a suit. He was an Afro-Latino man dressed in a simple, high-quality black t-shirt and dark denim. He had his arms crossed over his chest, leaning casually against the glass wall. While the other investors looked defensive, he was smiling. It was not a smirk. It was a smile of profound, genuine appreciation. After I stepped off the stage and navigated through the crowd of dismissive analysts, I found myself standing near the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, taking a moment to breathe. The natural sunlight poured over me, warming the cold tension in my shoulders. That was when he approached me. He moved with a quiet, grounded confidence, lacking entirely the frantic, desperate ambition that had constantly radiated from my ex-fiancé Marcus. He stopped just a few feet away, the bright sunlight catching the deep, rich brown of his skin. I looked up at him, peering over the broad line of his shoulder, and met his gaze. His eyes were incredibly warm, dark, and remarkably sincere. There was absolutely no calculation in them. There was no agenda. He looked at me as if I were the most fascinating, brilliant person he had ever encountered in his entire life. "Your predictive modeling on seasonal inventory bottlenecking is completely ruthless," he said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone with a slight, captivating accent. "The traditional logistics companies are going to absolutely hate you, and that means you are going to make a terrifying amount of money." I braced myself, waiting for the inevitable condescending question about whether I had a male co-founder or if I needed help managing the technical backend. But the question never came. Instead, he asked me a highly complex, incredibly specific question about my machine learning algorithms and how they integrated with real-time Port Authority data. I answered him without missing a beat, and for the next 20 minutes, we stood in the golden sunlight and engaged in the most intellectually stimulating conversation I had experienced in my entire life. He did not talk over me. He did not try to explain my own technology back to me. He listened with absolute laser-focused intent. "I am Matteo," he finally said, offering his hand. "I work in the investment sector. I focus on emerging digital infrastructures." I shook his hand, feeling a strange immediate spark of electricity. "I am Nia. But you already know that from the pitch." "I know your name and I know your algorithm," Matteo replied, a soft, genuine smile spreading across his face. "But I would very much like to know the brilliant woman who built a system that complex entirely on her own. I also want to tell you that your presentation was magnificent. And your hair is absolutely beautiful. It commands the room exactly the way you do." The compliment hit me so deeply, it almost knocked the wind out of my lungs. My mother had called my natural hair an unrefined mess. My father had viewed it as a corporate liability. Marcus had ignored the psychological violence my family inflicted on my appearance. But Matteo looked at me, saw the exact things they had tried to crush, and called them beautiful. He did not want to package me into a neat, straight-haired society wife. He respected the fierce, untamed reality of who I was. Matteo did not invite me to a fancy, pretentious dinner. He bought me a simple cup of coffee at a small, loud cafe down the street from the pavilion. We sat at a tiny wooden table for 3 hours. I told him about the grueling 2 years I had spent coding in my freezing apartment. I told him about the 42 rejections from investors who wanted me to build a lifestyle blog instead of a global logistics empire. I did not tell him about the Pierce family or the betrayal in Atlanta. I kept my past locked away, completely focused on the future. Matteo did not pry. He simply listened to my vision with an unwavering, profound respect. Before we parted ways that afternoon, Matteo pulled a simple leather notebook from his pocket and wrote down a number. He slid the paper across the table. "I want to fund your seed round, Nia. Not as a venture capitalist trying to buy your company out from under you, but as a strategic partner. You keep majority control. You stay the CEO. I will provide the capital oxygen you need to scale the servers and hire a dedicated engineering team. Your brain is a once-in-a-generation asset, and I want to be the one standing beside you when you take over the market." I looked at the number written on the paper. It was exactly the amount of capital I needed to launch the platform globally down to the final euro. It was a massive financial commitment offered by a man wearing a plain black t-shirt who simply believed in my genius. I did not have to negotiate my dignity. I did not have to promise to attend high society galas or change my personality to fit his portfolio. Matteo Castillo became the very first strategic partner of my tech platform. He injected life-saving capital into my business, but more importantly, he injected a profound sense of validation into my soul. The crushing, lonely fight for survival was finally over. The platform was fully funded, the servers were expanding, and for the first time since I fled Atlanta, I was no longer fighting the war alone. I had found an equal. The next 3 years moved with the unstoppable, terrifying velocity of a bullet train. The algorithms I had coded on the freezing floor of my tiny apartment did exactly what I designed them to do. They completely dismantled the European luxury logistics market. We scaled from that cramped studio in El Raval to a massive glass-walled headquarters in the heart of Barcelona's tech district. The valuation of my company skyrocketed from a desperate seed round to 50 million, then 100 million, and finally settled at a staggering valuation of over 400 million euros. I was no longer a struggling dropout trying to prove her worth to a family that despised her. I was a titan of the tech industry sitting at the helm of an empire I had built line by line, server by server. If you were to fly high above the golden coastline of Barcelona, looking down at the crystal clear waves of the Mediterranean, gently crashing against a secluded private beach, you would see the exact moment my life achieved absolute perfection. That was where Matteo and I finally stood to say our vows. There were no country club politicians. There were no aggressive society mothers fixing my hair or dictating the guest list to manage their public optics. There was just the warm Spanish sun, the sound of the ocean, and a small, fiercely protective circle of brilliant, loyal people who had bled and fought alongside us to build our company. I wore a simple, flawless white silk gown that moved like water in the sea breeze. My natural curls were worn completely free, crowned with delicate white flowers. I looked at Matteo standing before me in a tailored linen suit, and I knew I had found the greatest partnership of my entire life. But the view from that peaceful beach contrasted wildly with the towering aggressive steel and glass skyscrapers dominating the financial districts of London, Frankfurt, and Madrid. Buildings that bore his exact name. It was only as we exchanged our rings and signed the marriage certificates that the full staggering reality of the man I was marrying came sharply into focus. Matteo was not just a quiet, brilliant investor in a black shirt who happened to have capital. He had deliberately downplayed his portfolio for years to ensure I never felt overshadowed or beholden to him while I was establishing my own dominance. The truth was that Matteo was the chairman and sole inheritor of the Castillo Group. It was the single most powerful, predatory, and cash-rich investment conglomerate in all of Europe. He controlled billions of euros. He moved global markets with a single phone call. He owned banks, commercial real estate empires, and massive tech incubators. And this incredibly dangerous, unimaginably wealthy man was completely unapologetically devoted to me. We became an absolute force of nature. A transatlantic power couple that struck pure terror into the hearts of traditional corporate boards. We operated with a ruthless, flawless synergy. My artificial intelligence platform provided the highly classified logistical data, mapping out the hidden financial weaknesses of global retail chains. Matteo's investment group provided the aggressive, limitless capital to execute hostile takeovers of those failing empires. We sat in penthouses overlooking the Seine in Paris and the Thames in London, sipping espresso and completely rewriting the rules of international commerce. We were young, we were brilliant, and we were absolutely untouchable. Yet despite the massive wealth accumulating in our accounts and the mounting industry accolades, I maintained a strict ironclad blackout on my personal identity in the United States. I operated exclusively under my married name, Nia Castillo. I routed all of my media presence through highly paid public relations executives who were legally bound by airtight non-disclosure agreements. I refused every single request for a photograph in American business magazines. I declined all video interviews. If an American outlet wanted to cover my tech platform, they received a sanitized corporate press release and a generic company logo. I intentionally became an absolute ghost to the American media landscape. As far as my father, my mother, my golden child sister, and my traitorous ex-fiancé knew, Nia Pierce had vanished off the face of the earth. They had no idea I was married to European financial royalty. They had no idea my personal net worth now dwarfed my father's entire real estate portfolio. They genuinely believed I was still starving in some unknown foreign gutter, completely destroyed by their rejection and struggling to survive. I let them live in their arrogant, delusional reality. I stayed perfectly hidden in the shadows across the Atlantic, accumulating massive power, sharpening my claws, and waiting. I knew the fragile nature of my father's business. I knew the reckless, unearned ambition of Marcus and Spencer. I knew that eventually their greed would cause them to overreach. And when their flimsy house of cards finally began to collapse, I wanted to be the invisible force waiting at the bottom to watch it fall. I just needed the perfect opportunity to strike. 5 years. That is exactly how long it took for the ghosts of Atlanta to finally reach across the ocean and attempt to drag me back into their twisted reality. I was sitting at the head of the custom marble conference table in our Barcelona headquarters when my private phone violently vibrated against the glass. The notification banner flashed a name I had not seen on a screen in half a decade: Chloe Pierce. My younger sister had somehow bypassed my primary corporate filters and tracked down a secure email address I used exclusively for initial vendor inquiries. I picked up the phone, bringing the high-definition screen close to my face. I did not feel a sudden spike of anxiety. I did not feel the familiar suffocating dread that used to accompany any communication from my family. I felt a cold, razor-sharp wave of absolute amusement. I opened the message and read the words my sister had typed. It was a masterclass in passive-aggressive Southern hospitality, dripping with the exact same toxic condescension she had perfected when we were teenagers. She began with a fake obligatory greeting, pretending she had simply lost my contact information and had been searching frantically to reconnect because she missed her big sister. Then she immediately transitioned to the real purpose of the email. She announced that they were throwing a massive, highly publicized gala at the most exclusive country club in the city to celebrate my father's 75th birthday. The entire Atlanta high society would be in attendance. The governor, the hospital board, the venture capitalists. It was not just a birthday party, it was a calculated, heavily orchestrated display of the Pierce family supremacy. But Chloe could not just send a simple invitation, she had to include the poison. She wrote that my father insisted the family portrait required every single member, even the ones who had stubbornly strayed from the path. Then came the lines that actually made me laugh out loud. I read them twice just to fully savor the sheer staggering audacity of her assumption. She wrote that she knew my little overseas tech project had likely failed by now, and that the European job market was notoriously unforgiving for unqualified expats. She said she hoped I had managed to scrape together enough money to afford a commercial flight home. If I was currently unemployed and struggling, her husband Spencer was willing to generously sponsor an economy class ticket so I could attend the dinner. She even offered to let me sleep in her guest house provided I promised not to cause any emotional scenes or embarrass the family in front of their important corporate investors. A low, dark laugh escaped my throat. The sound vibrated in the quiet, expansive space of my corner office. I looked up from the screen and stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Castillo Group skyline. Spencer, a mid-level investment banker who was desperately trying to claw his way up the Wall Street corporate ladder, was offering to buy an economy plane ticket for a woman whose personal net worth was currently sitting in the hundreds of millions of euros. The profound, almost comical level of their delusion was breathtaking. They genuinely pictured me destitute, broken, and desperate for a miserable handout. They truly believed I had spent the last 5 years crying in a foreign gutter. But Chloe was not finished. The email contained a secondary blow, a PDF attachment she had explicitly instructed me to open. It was a scanned copy of the Atlanta Business Chronicle. The front page featured a high-resolution glossy photograph of Marcus. He was wearing a bespoke suit standing confidently in front of his firm's heavy mahogany doors. He looked older, his face hardened by years of aggressive networking and climbing the elite social ranks. The bold headline declared him the youngest man in the history of his prestigious firm to be named senior partner. And right beside him, holding his arm and smiling her picture-perfect, subservient smile, was Camille. Chloe had attached a secondary press release detailing the exact reason for Marcus's massive promotion. He was the lead attorney facilitating a historic $500 million corporate merger. The details of the merger were highly classified, but the article practically worshipped Marcus as the legal mastermind who was about to close the biggest financial deal the city had seen in a decade. Chloe wanted me to see this. She wanted me to look at the man who had abandoned me and realize that he had won. She wanted me to see that choosing Camille and choosing my father's ruthless connections had catapulted him to the absolute pinnacle of wealth and success. She expected me to open that PDF and shatter into a million pieces, weeping over the billionaire lifestyle I had foolishly thrown away when I refused to play their submissive game. I zoomed in on Marcus's face on the screen. I traced the confident line of his jaw and the arrogant spark in his eyes. He thought he was completely untouchable. My father thought his legacy was permanently secured. Chloe and Spencer thought they were sitting comfortably at the very top of the food chain, looking down at the disgraced sister who had run away. They had orchestrated this entire invitation as a victory lap. They wanted me in that ballroom so they could parade their monumental success right in front of my face. They needed the visual contrast of my supposed failure to make their triumph taste even sweeter. They wanted to force me to watch Marcus and Camille toast to their incredible wealth, surrounded by my father's approving nods. I set the phone down on the cool marble of my desk. The cold smile remained etched across my face. They had absolutely no idea who they had just invited into their home. They were opening their front doors and welcoming a predator directly into their carefully constructed glass house. I was not the terrified, heartbroken girl who had fled Atlanta 5 years ago with a single suitcase and a shattered spirit. I was Nia Castillo. I had spent half a decade mastering the art of the corporate kill alongside the most powerful man in Europe. And if they wanted a family reunion to celebrate their $500 million merger, I was going to give them a family reunion they would never ever forget. I hit reply, typed a single sentence confirming my attendance, and pressed send. The trap had officially been set and they were the ones walking blindly into it. The surface of the custom-tempered glass conference table reflected the sprawling Barcelona skyline with razor-sharp clarity. The camera of my mind seemed to glide slowly along that flawless, cold expanse, moving past my discarded phone and settling on the heavy oak doors of my executive suite. They opened with a soft, expensive click. Mateo walked in. He did not wear a suit today, just a crisp black button-down that hugged the broad lines of his shoulders, but the sheer gravity of his presence instantly altered the atmospheric pressure in the room. He was a man who moved markets, and right now he was walking toward me, holding a thick black leather dossier sealed with the confidential insignia of the Castillo Group's acquisition division. He did not say a word at first. He simply walked around the long glass table stopped beside my chair and slid the heavy dossier directly in front of me. His dark eyes were burning with an intense predatory warmth. He leaned his hands against the edge of the glass, bringing his face close to mine. "I think you are going to find the latest prospect from our London mergers and acquisitions team highly entertaining," Nia Mateo said, his voice a low, smooth baritone. "It seems a certain American real estate portfolio is currently bleeding out in the water, and the sharks are circling." I flipped open the heavy leather cover. The first page was a comprehensive financial executive summary, and printed in bold, uncompromising black ink at the very top was the name of the target acquisition, Pierce Holdings Incorporated. My breath caught perfectly still in my chest. I looked at the numbers, and the sheer catastrophic magnitude of the data laid out before me was absolutely staggering. My father, the man who had sat at the head of a mahogany table and banished me from his empire for lacking financial pragmatism, was completely hopelessly bankrupt. I traced my finger down the columns of red ink. The Pierce family empire was not just failing, it was a rotting, hollowed-out carcass propped up by illegal financial maneuvering. My father had over-leveraged his commercial real estate assets to a terminal degree. He had taken out massive high-interest mezzanine loans against properties that were actively depreciating in value. But the true fatal blow came from the investment side. I flipped the page and saw the undeniable signature of my arrogant brother-in-law Spencer. The Wall Street prodigy who had mocked my tech startup had aggressively gambled my father's liquid capital on highly speculative, unregulated derivative markets. He had lost millions. They were facing imminent catastrophic default across 3 major banking institutions. Worse yet, the financial structuring they had used to cover up these massive losses bordered heavily on federal fraud. If the Securities and Exchange Commission looked closely at their books, Julian Pierce and Spencer would not just lose their country club memberships, they would be facing severe federal prison sentences. I looked up at Mateo, my mind rapidly processing the incredible poetic irony of the situation. They are drowning. I stated, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy. They are weeks away from total liquidation. Matteo nodded, pulling out the chair next to me and sitting down. They are not just drowning, Nia. They have tied concrete blocks to their own ankles. But here is the brilliant part. You received an email an hour ago bragging about Marcus making senior partner because he is orchestrating a historic $500 million merger. I looked back down at the dossier, the puzzle pieces violently snapping together. Marcus was not negotiating a merger. He was orchestrating a desperate life-saving bailout. He was legally attempting to package the toxic dying remains of my father's empire and sell it off before the federal regulators realized the entire portfolio was a fraudulent shell game. And they needed a buyer with enough liquid capital to swallow a $500 million acquisition without flinching. They came to us, I whispered, a slow, icy realization washing over my entire body. Marcus Davenport brought this to the Castillo Group. Matteo smiled, a dangerous, thrilling expression that perfectly matched the darkness pooling in my own chest. Marcus has been relentlessly calling our London directors for 3 weeks. He is begging for a meeting. He is pitching Pierce Holdings as a highly lucrative, undervalued asset that requires a quiet, rapid acquisition. He has absolutely no idea that the global chairman of the conglomerate he is on his knees praying to is married to the woman he discarded. The acquisition team flagged the file for my review this morning because of the asking price. The moment I saw your maiden name and the Atlanta address, I pulled the file directly off the floor and brought it straight to your desk. The silence in the grand glass office was absolute. I stared at the financial ruins of the people who had destroyed my youth. Chloe had just emailed me offering to buy me an economy-class plane ticket out of pity, while her husband was secretly responsible for burning her family's entire generational wealth to the ground. My father had demanded I learn the value of $1, yet his entire legacy was currently built on counterfeit ledgers and desperate lies. And Marcus, the man who traded me for a seat at the table of the elite, was now sweating in a tailored suit, working around the clock to salvage an empire that was essentially made of dust. A laugh bubbled up from the very bottom of my lungs. It was a cold, melodic sound that held 10 years of suppressed rage and 5 years of silent, grinding vindication. I leaned back in my leather chair, crossing my arms over my chest. The sheer, intoxicating rush of absolute power was unlike anything I had ever felt. I was no longer the victim of their narrative. I was the architect of their destruction. "What do you want to do?" mi amor, Matteo asked. His eyes locked onto mine with total, unwavering devotion. "Do you want me to instruct the London team to instantly reject the portfolio? We can let the banks foreclose on them by the end of the month. We can alert the federal regulators to the discrepancies in Spencer's ledgers and watch them go to prison from the comfort of our balcony. I will press the button right now. You just have to say the word." He was offering me a clean, bloodless execution. He was offering to wipe them off the map without me ever having to step foot on American soil again. It was a generous, protective offer, but looking at the fraudulent numbers on the pages before me, looking at the sheer arrogance of Chloe's email still glowing on my phone screen, a clean execution felt entirely too merciful. They did not just try to ruin me privately. They had humiliated me publicly. They had gathered in a sunlit breakfast room and systematically tried to strip me of my dignity, my confidence, and my future. They needed to understand exactly who had defeated them. I reached out and closed the heavy black leather cover of the Castillo Group dossier. I slid it back toward Matteo, my fingers lingering over the silver-embossed logo. "No," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, lethal whisper. "If we kill the deal today, they will just declare bankruptcy and blame the shifting economic market. They will play the victims. They will never know that I was the one holding the axe." Matteo's smile widened. He leaned closer, understanding exactly where my mind was going. "So what is the strategy, Madam CEO?" I looked at my husband, the man who had handed me the ultimate weapon to exact my revenge. "You are going to instruct your London directors to express extreme interest in the acquisition. Tell them the Castillo Group is highly motivated to fast-track the buyout. String Marcus along. Let him believe he has successfully secured the $500 million lifeline. Let my father breathe a massive sigh of relief. Let Spencer think he has escaped a federal indictment. Let them puff out their chests, polish their expensive shoes, and gather all their elite friends in that country club ballroom to celebrate their brilliant financial maneuvering. I stood up from my chair, walking over to the floor to ceiling glass windows, looking out over the sprawling, beautiful empire we had built. "We are going to Atlanta," I announced, turning back to face Mateo. "We are going to put on our best evening wear, and we are going to attend my father's 75th birthday gala. We are going to let them raise their glasses and toast to their monumental success. And then we are going to walk into that ballroom and burn their entire world to the ground while they watch." The game of cat and mouse had officially begun, and I was going to ensure they felt every single second of the trap snapping shut around their throats. The heavy brass doors of the Atlanta Piedmont Country Club swung open. I stepped onto the polished marble floors of the grand foyer, feeling the immediate electric shift in the atmosphere. The ambient hum of a string quartet and the clinking of champagne flutes seemed to lower instantly. Dozens of pairs of eyes turned toward me. The local politicians, the hospital board members, the real estate developers who had attended my disastrous engagement dinner 5 years ago. They were all here sipping expensive bourbon and waiting to witness the prodigal daughter's humiliating return. I kept my posture absolutely rigid. My chin was high, my steps measured, and completely devoid of hesitation. I was entirely alone. Mateo and I had orchestrated the timing flawlessly. He was currently sitting in the back of an armored Maybach half a mile down the road, ostensibly delayed by a crucial overseas conference call with his London directors. We knew that my arriving solo would feed perfectly into my family's delusion. They needed to see me as abandoned, isolated, and desperate. I was more than happy to give them exactly what they wanted for the first act of the evening. I walked through the crowded ballroom, feeling the heavy, scrutinizing gazes of Atlanta's elite tracking my every move. They were evaluating me, searching for signs of defeat. I was wearing a floor-length, deep emerald silk gown. It was custom-tailored for me by a private atelier in Paris. It had absolutely no visible branding, no flashy hardware, and no gaudy logos. It was a masterclass in quiet, unapologetic European wealth. But in a room full of people who equated success with aggressive, recognizable designer labels, my unmarked dress was instantly misread. I had barely reached the edge of the grand ballroom when they intercepted me. My mother Vivian and my sister Chloe moved in perfect synchronization, blocking my path like two heavily armed sentries. My mother was draped in aggressively branded couture diamonds glittering at her throat. Chloe stood beside her, a smug, satisfied smirk already plastered across her perfectly contoured face. Nia, my mother said, her voice dropping into a harsh, condescending whisper meant only for me. "You actually showed up. I assumed you would have the good sense to stay overseas rather than subject yourself to this level of public embarrassment. And alone, no less." I smiled warmly, refusing to give her a single inch of the defensive reaction she was desperate for. "Hello, Mother. It is wonderful to see you too. The gala looks incredibly expensive. I am sure Dad is thrilled." Chloe let out a sharp, mocking laugh, her eyes raking up and down my emerald gown with obvious disdain. "Well, we certainly know you did not contribute to the budget. Did you buy that dress off a clearance rack in Madrid? Spencer offered to send you money for a proper outfit. You really should have swallowed your pride and taken the wire transfer. It is a black tie event, Nia, not a charity auction. You look like you are still scraping by on pennies." I let the insult wash right over me. True wealth whispers, but my family only understood screaming. I did not bother explaining that the silk wrapping my body cost more than the down payment on Chloe's suburban home. I just kept smiling, projecting a calm, terrifying serenity. "I appreciate the fashion advice, Chloe," I replied, my voice smooth as glass. "But I assure you I am doing perfectly fine. My startup is keeping me quite busy." "Oh my God, you are still playing around with that little website!" A new, sickeningly sweet voice chimed in from behind me. I turned slowly. Camille was gliding toward us. The woman who had stolen my fiancé, colluded with my father, and happily taken my place in the social hierarchy. She looked radiant, glowing with the specific kind of triumph reserved for people who believe they have won the ultimate prize. She was wearing a blush pink maternity gown that perfectly accentuated her visibly pregnant stomach. She rested one hand protectively over her bump, while the other hand lifted to brush a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The movement was entirely calculated. It was designed exclusively to flash the massive 10-carat flawless diamond ring sitting heavy on her left hand. The ring Marcus had bought to seal his partnership with her family's trust. "Camille," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "Congratulations on the pregnancy. It seems you and Marcus have been incredibly productive since I left." Camille let out a breathless, arrogant giggle. She stepped directly into my personal space, radiating pure toxic superiority. "Thank you, Nia. We are absolutely thrilled. The baby is due in 3 months. Marcus is already setting up the trust funds. He is just so incredible. A real provider." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping into a tone of weaponized fake pity. "Honestly, Nia, I was shocked to see your name on the RSVP list. It is so brave of you to show up here tonight, especially looking so tired. I heard through the grapevine that your little Spanish startup is barely keeping the lights on. Poor thing. You really should have listened to Julian and given up that tech fantasy years ago." I maintained my direct eye contact. Camille's pupils were dilated with the sheer thrill of trying to crush me. She was feeding off what she assumed was my crushing inadequacy. "It is definitely a demanding industry, Camille," I responded smoothly, not breaking my gaze. "But I managed to keep things afloat." "And how is Marcus doing? I imagine the pressure of climbing the corporate ladder is quite heavy." Camille laughed again, throwing her head back to make sure the surrounding guests noticed how happy and unbothered she was by my presence. "Oh, Nia, you have absolutely no idea. Marcus is not just climbing the ladder, he owns the ladder. He was just named senior partner at his firm. He is currently finalizing a $500 million corporate merger." $500 million. Can you even comprehend that kind of money? He is saving an entire corporate portfolio from total collapse. "When this deal closes tomorrow, we will essentially own this city." My mother nodded proudly, placing a manicured hand on Camille's shoulder. "Marcus is the brilliant son this family always needed. He understands the value of high-level corporate synergy. He is protecting our legacy." I looked at the 3 women standing before me. My mother, who had sold me out, my sister, who constantly mocked me, and my former best friend, who was actively bragging about the immense wealth she thought she was securing. They were inflating their chests, intoxicated by the illusion of their massive success. They were standing on the deck of a sinking ship, bragging about the luxurious quality of the deck chairs, completely unaware of the gaping hole in the hull. Camille was flaunting a 10-carat diamond bought with credit that was about to default. My mother was boasting about a family legacy that was currently suffocating under a mountain of fraudulent debt. And they were all praising Marcus for securing a $500 million lifeline from an anonymous European conglomerate, completely oblivious to the fact that the absolute authority over that exact lifeline was currently sitting in a Maybach outside the club, waiting for my text message to enter the room. "That is incredibly impressive, Camille," I said, allowing a slow, dangerous smile to finally spread across my face. "A $500 million deal is certainly nothing to joke about. I hope Marcus knows exactly who he is getting into bed with. International investors can be so incredibly ruthless when they find out a portfolio is full of toxic assets. It would be a terrible tragedy if his historic deal suddenly fell through." Camille frowned, her perfectly arched eyebrows pulling together in momentary confusion. She did not like my tone. She did not like that I was not crying, begging, or shrinking away in shame. She opened her mouth to deliver another insult, but a sharp, authoritative voice cut through the tension. "All right, everyone, take your seats. The presentation is about to begin." My father's voice boomed over the ballroom's sound system. The main event was starting, the moment where they would publicly celebrate their financial salvation. I looked at Camille, Chloe, and my mother one last time. "Excuse me, ladies," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing, lethal whisper. "I need to go find my seat. I would not want to miss a single second of Marcus's big moment. It is going to be truly unforgettable." I turned my back on them, and walked gracefully toward the back of the room, pulling my phone from my clutch. I opened my messages, typed a single word to Mateo, and hit send. Now. I slipped my phone back into my emerald silk clutch after sending the signal and continued my walk toward the very edges of the grand ballroom. My father had orchestrated every single detail of this gala, and the seating chart was his ultimate geographical insult. I was assigned to table 42. It was shoved into the darkest, most irrelevant corner of the venue, positioned dangerously close to the swinging kitchen doors, where the waitstaff rushed back and forth with heavy trays. The visual contrast was intentionally stark and incredibly cruel. In the dead center of the room, bathed in the brilliant, blinding glow of a massive crystal chandelier, sat the VIP table. It was adorned with towering white orchids, gold-rimmed place settings, and custom-printed menus. That was where Marcus, Camille, Chloe, and Spencer were currently taking their seats, buzzing with the electric, nervous anticipation of greeting their financial savior. I took my seat at the small, cramped table surrounded by distant elderly relatives, who looked at me with a mixture of pity and utter confusion. Great Aunt Beatrice leaned over and patted my hand, asking in a loud, sympathetic whisper if I was still doing that little computer hobby in Europe, and if I needed her to pack up some extra dinner rolls for me to take home. I smiled warmly and politely declined, keeping my posture perfectly straight. I refused to look like the defeated victim they all expected me to be. Across the vast expanse of the ballroom, I saw my father Julian standing near the VIP table. He was directing the high society traffic like an arrogant maestro, shaking hands with the mayor and several prominent hospital board members. He caught my eye through the crowd. He did not smile. He gave a sharp, dismissive nod, a silent, brutal confirmation that my banishment to the shadows was completely intentional. He wanted me to sit in the dark and watch my replacement bask in the spotlight. He wanted me to choke on my alleged failure, while Marcus and Camille were celebrated as the new royalty of Atlanta. Before the first course of salads could even be served, a shadow fell across my table. Spencer, my white Wall Street brother-in-law, had strolled over from the VIP section. He held a heavy crystal glass of scotch, his posture dripping with the unearned, staggering confidence of a man playing a high-stakes game with other people's money. He did not ask for permission. He simply pulled out the empty chair next to me and leaned in close, bringing with him the suffocating scent of expensive cologne and pure, unadulterated arrogance. "Nia, I saw your little interaction with Camille over by the entrance." Spencer began, his voice lowered into a patronizing, authoritative tone. "You really need to drop this defensive, hostile act. It is incredibly embarrassing for everyone involved. You showed up here alone in an unmarked dress trying to look proud. But we all know the truth. We know how the European tech market operates. Women with zero institutional backing do not survive. You are bleeding cash, and your pride is preventing you from admitting you made a catastrophic mistake." I turned my head slowly to look at him. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I just stared at the arrogant, foolish man who had secretly gambled my father's entire real estate portfolio on highly illegal, unregulated derivative markets and lost absolutely everything. "Is that your professional financial assessment, Spencer?" I asked, my voice smooth and dangerously calm. He scoffed, taking a slow sip of his scotch. "It is the financial reality, Nia. You live in a fantasy world of coding and algorithms. We live in the real world of tangible capital. Marcus is sitting at that VIP table right now because he is about to close a $500 million merger with a massive European investment conglomerate, a deal that I personally helped structure. We are saving the entire Atlanta commercial real estate market tonight. We are moving mountains while you are struggling to keep your head above water." He leaned in even closer, dropping his voice into a tone of weaponized fake pity. He rested his arm on the back of my chair, trying to physically intimidate me. "Listen, I talked to Chloe. We are willing to throw you a lifeline. I am expanding my private equity division next month. I need a new administrative assistant. You can manage my calendar, fetch coffee, and organize my files. It pays $40,000 a year, which is probably a fortune compared to whatever you are making in Spain right now. You can swallow your pride, move back to Atlanta, and learn how real money actually moves. Consider it a family favor. I looked at the expensive gold watch gleaming on his wrist. I knew for a fact he had bought it using funds siphoned from a failing mezzanine loan. The sheer breathtaking irony of a man who was weeks away from a federal prison sentence offering me an entry-level assistant job was almost too delicious to bear. He genuinely believed he was untouchable. He believed he was the master of the universe, completely unaware that he was pitching pennies to a billionaire. I smiled at him. It was a cold, terrifying smile that did not reach my eyes. I prefer to manage my own assets, Spencer. You never know when a risky, over-leveraged investment portfolio might suddenly collapse and take everyone down with it. It is always better to be the person holding the capital rather than the person begging for a bailout from a foreign entity you do not even know. Spencer's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. A tiny, imperceptible flash of panic crossed his eyes before his arrogant facade snapped back into place. He had no idea how I could possibly know about his financial crimes, so he quickly dismissed my comment as the bitter rambling of a jealous sister. "You are completely delusional," Nia, Spencer sneered, standing up and straightening his tailored suit jacket. "The people we are meeting tonight are the Castillo Group. They are European titans. They are ruthless, and they operate in a financial echelon you will never ever reach. Enjoy your dinner in the corner. Try not to make a scene when the real billionaires arrive." I watched him walk back to the brilliantly lit VIP table, taking his seat next to Chloe. He leaned over and whispered something to her, and they both looked in my direction and laughed. At the center of the table, Marcus was sweating. He kept wiping his palms on his white linen napkin and checking his phone every 30 seconds. He was desperate. The entire Pierce family empire was hanging by a single fragile thread, and Marcus believed he was the one holding it. Beside him, Camille rested a hand on her pregnant stomach, looking around the room with the haughty pride of a queen waiting for her coronation. A white-gloved waiter approached my hidden table and poured a generous measure of vintage red wine into my crystal glass. I picked it up by the delicate stem and took a slow, deliberate sip. The rich, heavy taste of the wine perfectly matched the dark, intoxicating thrill building in my chest. My phone vibrated silently against my leg inside my silk clutch. I slipped it out under the table and glanced at the bright screen. It was the confirmation message from Mateo I had been waiting for. "Security cleared. Walking into the main lobby. See you in 60 seconds, Mrs. Castillo." I locked the screen and placed the phone face down on the tablecloth. The waiting was finally over. I leaned back in my chair, resting my hands gracefully in my lap. I looked toward the grand, towering double doors at the very front of the ballroom. The trap was fully primed, the bait had been taken, and the ultimate predator was finally entering the building. I kept my eyes locked on those doors, my heart beating with the steady, calm rhythm of absolute victory. The gentle hum of the string quartet abruptly faded, replaced by the sharp, authoritative ringing of a silver spoon tapping against crystal. My father, Julian Pierce, had stepped up to the grand podium positioned directly in front of the VIP table. A heavy spotlight snapped on, illuminating him in a blinding pool of white light. The entire ballroom fell into a hushed, reverent silence. I watched him smooth the lapels of his bespoke tuxedo, soaking in the attention like a man dying of thirst. If someone were holding a camera right now, the frame would be vibrating with the nervous electric tension radiating from the center of the room. My father was a master of public relations, but I could see the microscopic beads of sweat forming along his hairline. He was a desperate man, putting on the performance of a lifetime to hide a crumbling empire. "Welcome, distinguished guests, friends and esteemed colleagues." My father's voice boomed through the high-fidelity sound system washing over the hundreds of attendees. "Tonight, we are not just celebrating my 75th birthday. We are celebrating the unyielding endurance of the Pierce family legacy. In a rapidly changing economic landscape, survival requires absolute ruthlessness. It requires surrounding yourself with visionaries who understand that true power is built on tangible assets, elite partnerships, and unwavering loyalty." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the wealthy crowd. He gestured grandly toward the center table. "That is why tonight, I want to publicly honor the two men who represent the magnificent future of this family. My son-in-law Spencer and my soon-to-be son-in-law, Marcus Davenport. The ballroom erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. Spencer leaned back in his chair, adjusting his tie with a sickeningly smug expression, playing the role of the Wall Street genius. Marcus stood up and gave a modest practiced nod to the crowd, placing a hand over his heart. They were soaking up the praise, completely intoxicated by their own fraudulent success. My father leaned closer to the microphone, his voice dropping into a tone of serious manufactured gravity. Building a dynasty is not for the faint of heart. It requires making incredibly difficult pragmatic decisions. A strong family needs people who understand how to sacrifice their personal desires for the greater good of the empire. He turned his head slowly, his piercing gaze cutting through the brilliant light of the chandeliers, seeking out the shadows. He looked directly past the wealthy politicians and hospital board members, aiming his stare precisely at table 42. At me. We need individuals who know how to elevate our standing. My father continued, his voice dripping with unmistakable, venomous intention. We do not need selfish, stubborn people who walk away and abandon their duties the moment they are asked to compromise. Loyalty is the ultimate currency. And I am profoundly grateful that Marcus found a partner in Camille, who exemplifies the absolute grace, intelligence, and sophisticated loyalty required to stand at the top of this city. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Everyone knew exactly who he was talking about. Dozens of heads turned slightly, casting sideways glances into the dark corner where the disgraced runaway daughter was sitting. They expected me to shrink in my chair. They expected me to look down at my lap in burning shame, utterly crushed by my father's public execution of my character. Instead, I shifted my weight comfortably in my seat. I locked eyes with my father across the vast expanse of the ballroom. I did not glare. I did not frown. I simply raised a single perfectly arched eyebrow and took another slow, deliberate sip of my vintage red wine. I held his gaze with a cold, terrifying serenity that made his own expression falter for a fraction of a second. He quickly looked away, unnerved by the fact that his ultimate psychological weapon had absolutely no effect on me. My father cleared his throat, recovering his booming cadence. And now I turn the floor over to Marcus, the brilliant legal mind who is about to secure the most lucrative historic chapter in Atlanta's corporate history. Marcus practically leaped onto the stage, taking the microphone from my father. He was vibrating with pure, unadulterated ego. His chest was puffed out, his eyes shining with the frantic, desperate energy of a man who believes he has just conquered the entire world. He looked out at the sea of wealthy investors and politicians ready to claim his crown. "Thank you, Julian," Marcus announced, his voice ringing with absolute triumph. 5 years ago, I promised this family that I would secure our place at the highest echelon of global finance. I promised that we would not just participate in the market, but that we would completely dominate it. Tonight, I am delivering on that promise. Marcus raised his crystal champagne flute high into the air. He looked down at Camille, who was gazing up at him with total adoration, rubbing her pregnant stomach to maximize the optics of their perfect, powerful union. Chloe and Spencer were grinning from ear to ear, already mentally spending the millions they thought they were about to secure. For the past 3 weeks, Marcus continued, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. I have been in intensive classified negotiations with the single most powerful investment conglomerate in Europe. We are finalizing a $500 million merger that will inject massive, unprecedented foreign capital directly into our real estate portfolio. This deal will make Pierce Holdings an untouchable global entity. And I am incredibly honored to announce that we are currently waiting for the chairman of that conglomerate to arrive at this very venue. The crowd murmured in awe. A $500 million foreign investment was staggering news. The local politicians were already calculating how to align themselves with Marcus's newly acquired power. We are waiting for Mr. Mateo Castillo, the chairman of the Castillo Group, to walk through those doors in person, Marcus declared, his voice rising to a triumphant shout. When he walks in, the contract will be signed right here tonight. This is not just a birthday celebration. This is the dawn of a new corporate empire. This is our era." The ballroom exploded into thunderous applause. Marcus stood on the stage, drinking in the standing ovation. Camille clapped elegantly, blowing him a kiss. Spencer and Chloe stood up, raising their glasses in a victorious toast. My father patted Marcus heavily on the back, his face flushed with the absolute certainty that he had just won the game of a lifetime. Their arrogance had reached its absolute blinding peak. They had built an entire monument to their own genius, convinced they were the untouchable gods of Atlanta high society. I sat quietly in my dark corner, watching them celebrate their magnificent, fraudulent victory. I set my wine glass down on the crisp white tablecloth. The applause was deafening, but beneath the roaring sound of their misplaced triumph, I heard the distinct heavy click of the grand double doors at the back of the ballroom unlatching. The 60 seconds were officially up. The heavy oak doors at the back of the grand ballroom did not just open. They were thrust apart with such violent commanding force that the heavy brass handles slammed hard against the interior walls. The sharp echoing crack instantly killed the thunderous applause. Every single head in the room snapped toward the entrance. From my vantage point in the shadows, my mental camera locked into a perfectly still, wide, static shot, capturing the exact moment the atmosphere in the room shifted from triumphant arrogance to absolute suffocating terror. Mateo Castillo stepped over the threshold. As he moved into the brilliant light of the chandeliers, time itself seemed to stretch into a dramatic, agonizing slow motion. He did not look like a man arriving to attend a birthday party. He looked like an emperor arriving to conquer a highly vulnerable territory. He was flanked by a severe, impenetrable wall of private security and 3 elite European corporate attorneys carrying heavy leather briefcases. Mateo wore a masterfully tailored midnight blue tuxedo that highlighted his broad shoulders and the rich dark brown of his skin. He radiated a quiet, lethal dominance that made the wealthy politicians and local real estate developers in the room look like absolute amateurs. On the stage, Marcus practically dropped the microphone. I watched the color rapidly drain from his face before a desperate, frantic surge of adrenaline took over. Julian and Spencer moved in exact synchronization. The 3 men scrambled off the raised platform, practically tripping over their own expensive shoes in a pathetic, undignified race to reach the back of the room first. They shoved past the local mayor and elbowed hospital board members out of the way, desperate to grovel at the feet of their ultimate financial savior. "Mr. Castillo." My father gasped out, reaching the entrance first. He bowed his head, extending both of his hands in a gesture of pure, sycophantic desperation. "It is an absolute honor. Welcome to Atlanta." Marcus slid in right beside my father, his chest heaving, a frantic, eager smile plastered across his sweating face. "Sir, I am Marcus Davenport. We spoke on the phone. We have the private boardroom prepared for the contract signing. The entire portfolio is ready for your immediate review." Spencer hovered right behind them, nodding aggressively, trying to catch Mateo's eye, to prove he belonged in the inner circle of this massive transaction. They were fawning over him, radiating a thick, nauseating wave of desperation. They were begging for the $500 million lifeline that would save them from total ruin and federal prison. Mateo did not stop walking. He did not slow his stride. He did not offer his hand. He did not even blink. He walked straight through them. He treated the 3 most arrogant men in my family as if they were completely invisible. He brushed past Marcus's outstretched, trembling hand with a cold, devastating indifference that sent a physical shockwave through the crowd. My father stumbled backward, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. Marcus and Spencer spun around, their faces masks of sheer panic, as they desperately trailed behind Mateo's security detail like lost, terrified children. The sea of elite guests parted silently as Mateo marched purposefully down the center aisle of the ballroom. He ignored the beautifully decorated VIP table. He completely ignored Camille, who was standing up and trying to catch his attention with a confused, polite smile. He bypassed the white orchids and the crystal champagne flutes entirely. He walked directly into the darkest, most secluded corner of the room. He walked straight up to table 42. I remained perfectly seated, my hands resting gracefully in my lap. Mateo stopped right in front of me. The massive ballroom was so profoundly silent that the only sound left in the world was the soft rustle of my silk dress as I finally stood up to meet him. Mateo did not shake my hand. He did not offer a polite corporate greeting. In front of the entire Atlanta high society, in front of the father who had banished me, the sister who had mocked me, and the fiancé who had sold me, the billionaire chairman of the Castillo Group dropped smoothly to one knee. He took my right hand in both of his, bowing his head slightly, and pressed a long, deeply tender kiss against my knuckles. "Sorry I am late, mi amor," Mateo said, standing back up. His deep, resonant voice carried effortlessly across the dead silent room, amplifying into every single corner. He did not break eye contact with me. His gaze was entirely consumed by love and a dark, thrilling sense of shared victory. "Have you told your family our decision yet?" Mateo asked, his voice ringing with absolute terrifying clarity. "Have you told them that we have officially decided to cancel the acquisition entirely?" I smiled, a slow, brilliant, victorious smile that radiated from the very depths of my soul. I let the silence stretch for one agonizing second before I answered. "Not yet, my love. I wanted to wait for you." Mateo finally turned his head, looking over his shoulder at the three men standing frozen just a few feet away. His dark eyes locked onto Marcus, stripping away every ounce of the lawyer's unearned pride. "My wife reviewed your financial ledgers this afternoon." Marcus Mateo stated, his tone dropping the final devastating anvil onto their crumbling empire. "She told me your entire real estate portfolio is built on fraudulent derivative markets and toxic debt. And my wife is absolutely brilliant. She was right. Your company is not worth a single penny. The Castillo Group is officially withdrawing our offer." The physical reaction was instantaneous and violently beautiful. The heavy crystal champagne flute slipped directly through Marcus's trembling fingers. It hit the marble floor, shattering into 1,000 glittering pieces. The sharp, explosive crash echoed through the paralyzed ballroom, the perfect sound of his entire political and financial future being completely destroyed. Spencer staggered backward, bumping hard into a nearby table. His arrogant, privileged face drained of all blood, turning a sickly, translucent shade of white. He gripped the edge of a chair, his knees buckling as the horrifying reality of a federal fraud indictment finally crushed his chest. He knew the money was gone. He knew he was going to prison. But it was my father who provided the most poetic collapse. Julian Pierce, the man who demanded absolute loyalty and sold his own daughter for a seat at the elite table, let out a ragged, strangled gasp. He raised a shaking hand, desperately clutching the lapel of his expensive tuxedo right over his heart. He reeled sideways, catching himself heavily against a structural pillar to keep from hitting the floor. His eyes were wide, darting wildly between my face and Mateo's face. The horrifying, suffocating truth had finally struck him like a sledgehammer. He had not just insulted a runaway daughter. He had directly insulted the single most powerful woman in the room, the woman who completely controlled his financial survival. He had banished the very person who held the key to his entire empire, and now that empire was officially dead. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, broken only by the sound of my father's heavy, panicked breathing as he leaned against the structural pillar. I looked at Julian Pierce, the man who had traded his own daughter for a corporate advantage, and then I turned my gaze to Marcus, the man who had so eagerly accepted the deal. I took one deliberate step forward, my voice cutting through the stunned crowd with crystal clarity. "You were right, Dad," I said, maintaining unwavering eye contact with the men who thought they could discard me. "Marcus is absolutely excellent at building a foundation." But unfortunately, I just crushed that foundation to dust. I did not wait for a response. There was absolutely nothing left for them to say. I placed my hand securely in Mateo's, and together we turned our backs on the complete wreckage of the Pierce family empire. We walked out of that grand ballroom exactly as we had entered, moving with absolute dominance and perfect grace. The heavy brass doors closed firmly behind us, sealing them inside their own self-made financial tomb. The fallout over the next few weeks was spectacular and entirely merciless. Without the Castillo Group's capital injection, My father's real estate conglomerate officially filed for bankruptcy before the end of the month. Federal regulators swooped in exactly as we had predicted. Spencer was immediately stripped of his title and fired from his investment firm, disgraced and permanently blacklisted from Wall Street as the investigations into his fraudulent trading began. Marcus faced the most humiliating professional execution of all. He was publicly terminated by his law firm for single-handedly losing the most lucrative merger in their corporate history. Camille quickly realized that marrying a disgraced unemployed lawyer was not part of her glamorous society plan, and their perfect strategic relationship completely imploded. The memory of their stunned faces fades as I sit here now in the bright warm sunlight of my own living room. Looking around the beautiful, authentic life I built from scratch, I feel a profound sense of peace. My family tried to convince me that my worth was tied to their conditional approval, demanding I shrink myself to fit into their superficial, toxic mold. But I learned the most valuable lesson of my life in the freezing isolation of a foreign city. Your true value is never determined by where you come from, and it is certainly never determined by the validation of people who are too blind to see your brilliance. You possess the power to build your own empire, and you have the absolute right to walk away from any room where you are not fiercely respected. Have you ever had to walk away from your family to discover your true worth? Let me know your story in the comments below. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to hear more stories about reclaiming your independence and building your own power.